This is Why There Really Is a God, and I'm Andrew Wilson. And in this video we're going to look at one of the most common atheist objections to God. Richard Dawkins became an atheist in his teens when he discovered Darwin. And Richard Dawkins has said that Darwin made it possible to be an intellectually fulfilled atheist. Atheists argue that evolution has put God out of a job. God is not our creator, evolution is. Is this true? We're going to look at three important pieces of evidence to help decide whether science has disproven God. The first important evidence is fossils. Fossils are the remains of animals and plants buried in the Earth's rock layers. Fossils are the most important evidence for evolution. Here is a picture of the fossil evidence for dinosaurs. This is the evolutionary family tree of dinosaurs. And this picture comes from Paul Sereno, one of the world's leading dinosaur experts. He wrote an article about dinosaurs in Encyclopedia Britannica. And this picture comes from a 1999 article Sereno wrote in the world's top science journal called Science. In this family tree there are over 40 different types of dinosaurs, including all the favourites. Stegosaurus, with rows of plates on its back and spikes on its tail. Triceratops, with 3 horns on its head. Diplodocus, with a long neck and a long tail. Tyrannosaurus rex, Archaeopteryx, and birds. Now the graph shows the fossils of these 40 odd different dinosaurs from 235 million years ago till 65 million years ago, when the dinosaurs disappeared. Billions and billions of dinosaurs would have lived during this period of 175 million years. Enough for many, many fossils to form. Now if you look at the picture, you will see black vertical lines and red dotted horizontal lines. The black lines on the chart show the actual dinosaur fossils that have been found in the ground. But the red dotted lines are different. There are no actual fossils here. Instead, the red dotted lines show the hypothesized evolutionary links, the missing links, if you want, between the dinosaurs. So why is this such an important picture? Because it shows there is no fossil evidence of links between the different dinosaurs. All the links are missing. There are no fossils which show one sort of dinosaur gradually changing into another sort of dinosaur. In fact, the black vertical lines show that all the dinosaurs stay exactly the same as time passes. A Stegosaurus does not gradually move sideways and change into a Triceratops or a Tyrannosaurus rex. It just stays a Stegosaurus. All the horizontal links between the different types of dinosaurs are red dotted lines. They are not black, which would mean there are actual fossils linking the dinosaurs. All the links are red, which means that they are imaginary, theoretical links. There is no gradual evolution happening in the dinosaur family tree. Now, why is this such a big deal? Well, in Darwin's day, the fossil record was a problem for his theory. Darwin wrote that the number of intermediate and transitional links between all living and extinct species must have been inconceivably great, because evolution happened gradually by infinitesimally small modifications over millions of years. Darwin asked, why then is not every geological formation and every stratum full of such intermediate links? Geology assuredly does not reveal any such finely graduated organic chain, and this, perhaps, is the most obvious and gravest objection which can be argued against my theory. The explanation lies, however, in the extreme imperfection of the geological record. In other words, Darwin said that with further exploration we would find evidence of missing links in the fossils. However, in the 150 years since Darwin, literally billions of fossils have been collected, but the missing links are still missing. And it's not just the dinosaur family tree that looks like this. Every single family tree of every sort of animal looks like the dinosaur family tree. They show no actual fossil evidence of evolutionary transitions. All the missing links are missing. Here is what Professor George Gaylord Simpson, perhaps the most important paleontologist, that's a fossil hunter, of the 20th century, stated. This lack of evolutionary fossil transitions is true of all 32 orders of mammals. The earliest and most primitive known members of every order already have the basic ordinal characters, and in no case is an approximately continuous sequence from one order to another known. In most cases, the break is so sharp and the gap so large that the origin of the order is speculative and much disputed. This regular absence of transitional forms is not confined to mammals, but is an almost universal phenomenon, and has long been noted by paleontologists. It is true of almost all classes of animals, both vertebrate and invertebrate. It is true of the classes and of the major animal phyla, and it is apparently also true of analogous categories of plants. In other words, the family tree of every order of mammals and every other class of animals looks just like the dinosaur family tree. Lots of black vertical lines, animals staying the same, and lots of red dotted horizontal lines showing all the missing links are still missing. There are no actual fossils of animals evolving into other animals. Stephen Jay Gould, another famous paleontologist, wrote, "The extreme rarity of transitional forms in the fossil record persists as the trade secret of paleontology." Elsewhere he wrote, "All paleontologists know that the fossil record contains precious little in the way of intermediate forms. Transitions between major groups are characteristically abrupt." In other words, instead of a finely graded, slowly changing chain of life among the fossils, as Darwin predicted, the record instead shows extremely few intermediates between different types of animals. Dr. Colin Patterson, senior paleontologist at the British Museum of Natural History, was asked why he had included no transitional forms in his book on evolution. He replied, "I fully agree with your comments on the lack of direct illustration of evolutionary transitions. If I knew of any, fossil or living, I would certainly have included them. Yet Gould and the American Museum people are hard to contradict when they say there are no transitional fossils. I will lay it on the line. There is not one such fossil for which one could make a watertight argument." If life evolved gradually with lots of infinitesimally small changes over hundreds of millions of years, the picture should show fossils of animals gradually branching out and transitioning into other types of animals. Instead, the picture is the exact opposite. Animals stay the same and there are no transitional fossils. Now, before I tell you how atheists respond to this fossil problem, I want to tell you a story. Imagine that there are 400 weather stations around the world that meteorologists use to measure whether global temperatures are rising or not. And that out of these 400 weather stations, there were 396 that said the temperature was rising, but there were 4 weather stations that said it was not. What would you say to someone who argued that the 4 weather stations with no increase in temperature prove that global warming is a hoax? Now, before anyone gets angry, this is an entirely imaginary scenario I have just made up. I have no idea how many weather stations are used to tell us about global temperatures, nor do I know what they say. But should we prefer the evidence from the 396 weather stations or the evidence from the 4 weather stations? Of course we should go with what the 396 tell us. We should follow the 99% of the evidence rather than the 1%. Now, this is precisely the situation we see with the fossils. Atheists point to a very small number of cases of possible missing links and claim that they are proof of evolution. They point to the 4 weather stations out of 400, or 1% of the evidence. They don't tell the public about the 99% of fossil evidence that is against evolution. Now let me show you how evolutionary biologists reply to the problem of the missing links. What they do is to argue that there are some very good cases of missing links. In fact, they say that we can see one in the dinosaur family chart we saw before. The second last column on the right of the chart represents one of evolutionary biology's most famous animals, called Archaeopteryx, which is considered a transitional fossil between reptiles, like dinosaurs, and birds, which is the final column on the right of the chart. Archaeopteryx was discovered in Germany in 1861, 2 years after Darwin's Origin of Species. Archaeopteryx shared certain features of birds, like wings, feathers, and a beak, and certain features of reptiles, teeth, a long tail, and a claw on the wings. It was immediately hailed as proof of Darwin's theory, as evidence that reptiles had evolved into birds. However, it is very doubtful that Archaeopteryx was a missing link, half dinosaur, half bird. Alan Fiducia, a bird expert, says paleontologists have tried to turn Archaeopteryx into an earthbound feathered dinosaur, but it's not. It's a bird, a perching bird, and no amount of paleobabble is going to change that. Archaeopteryx was simply an extinct bird. It had a bird's special avian lungs, a large wishbone for flight, and it had feathers. Some other fossil birds also had teeth and claws and long tails. But even if we were to accept Archaeopteryx as a missing link between reptiles and birds, there is still a huge problem. There have now been 12 fossil specimens of Archaeopteryx discovered, and all show exactly the same form. On the dinosaur family chart, they all sit on the one spot. Why aren't they at slightly different stages of evolutionary transition from a reptile to a bird? Why are there still no horizontal lines? If reptiles changed into birds over a few million years, then we would expect a few different forms of half reptile, half birds to show up, forming a gradual chain of reptiles slowly changing into birds. Instead, all of the Archaeopteryx fossils found show the exact same form. Evolutionists make a lot of noise about a few doubtful cases of fossils like Archaeopteryx that possibly qualify as missing link. But leave aside the debate over these possible cases and keep your eyes on the big picture. The big picture is the extreme rarity of transitional forms, as Stephen Jay Gould put it. What the atheists do, instead of showing us the big picture, they instead point to one fossil here or there that is a possible missing link. In other words, they point to the 1% of weather stations that say that global temperatures are not rising. Here's another way to think about the evolutionists' argument. Imagine if a geologist told you that once upon a time there was a land bridge that stretched all the way across the Pacific Ocean from California to China. If anyone ever asked for some proof of this ancient land bridge, this geologist would point to the Hawaiian Islands. Now that is nonsense, because the Hawaiian Islands are a mere pinprick on the map of the Pacific Ocean. But this is exactly what atheists do with the fossil evidence for evolution. They claim that the few possible missing links prove that evolution is true. But this is as laughable as saying that the Hawaiian Islands are proof of an ancient 10,000 kilometre land bridge that once connected California to China. This is what trial lawyers call selective citation of evidence. Politicians call it cherry picking. It is not an honest assessment of the evidence. It is an abuse of evidence. If gradual evolution over long ages were true, we would find the vast majority of fossils, more than 90%, many millions of fossils, were missing links, not a few maybes. So this is what the fossil evidence tells us. The missing links are all missing. Richard Dawkins was once asked, "Is evolution a theory, not a fact?" He replied, Evolution has been observed. It's just that it hasn't been observed while it's happening. And that just about sums it all up, doesn't it? The second important evidence for evolution is natural selection. I remember being in a high school class in my early teens when a student challenged a Christian teacher, "What about the peppered moths?" Now at the time I had never heard of peppered moths, but I got the impression that the question had something to do with evolution and that it was a powerful argument against God. So here's the story of the peppered moths. Before the Industrial Revolution in England, these moths were mostly light-coloured. Birds found the light-coloured moths hard to spot as they rested on the light-coloured tree trunks. They were camouflaged. And so the moths were less likely to be eaten. But after the Industrial Revolution had darkened the trees with soot, the moths turned dark, and so they again were able to hide themselves on the trunk of the trees. The peppered moths had evolved from a light colour to a dark colour. This is one of the most famous textbook cases of evolution in action. However, the important thing to understand about this story, and it's something that is often not clearly explained, was that there were both light and dark varieties of moths before the Industrial Revolution, as well as afterwards. Both varieties of moths were already in existence at the beginning. Nothing new evolved or appeared after the Industrial Revolution. Here is a little analogy I have heard used to explain what really happened to the peppered moths. When someone claims that the peppered moths evolved into a different colour, that is like saying that every time Israel and the Arab nations have a war, that Arabs are evolving into Jews because there are relatively less Arabs and relatively more Jews after the war. My classmate at school seemed to be very impressed by the story of the peppered moths, and so have millions of other people. But once I heard the full story, the real story, I realised that no actual moths evolved from light to dark colours. The light and dark coloured moths both existed before the Industrial Revolution. All that changed were the relative proportions of light and dark coloured moths, as birds ate more of one sort than the other in different conditions. The story of the peppered moths is a classic case of natural selection in action. But the story does not explain the origin of the light or dark colours, let alone the origin of the moths from some other different sort of animal. In the words of the famous evolutionist and genetics pioneer Hugo de Vries, natural selection explains the survival of the fittest, not the arrival of the fittest. That's why it's called natural selection, not natural creation. Another classic example of natural selection is the finches in the Galapagos Islands. The beaks of these birds changed size due to drought conditions. The seeds were tougher to crack during the drought, and so birds with smaller beaks died out. But again, all the different beak sizes were present before the drought came along. Natural selection caused changes in a population, but only by eliminating species struggling to survive the drought, not by creating new species. Natural selection is a culling mechanism, a killing machine, not a creative force. Many atheists claim that natural selection is the greatest scientific idea ever discovered. If natural selection were to be compared with a car, they would say that it was a powerful sports car, a Ferrari maybe. But now that we have seen how it actually works, natural selection turns out to be a lemon, a dud. It doesn't actually create anything new. It only eliminates. That's why it is sometimes called the survival of the fittest, which also entails the sacrifice of the weakest. Natural selection is not a creative force. It's a culling mechanism that gets rid of things that are not as well adapted to the environment as others. Natural selection is a fact of life, but it does not explain how all the wonderful biological designs arose on Earth. Granville Sewell, professor of mathematics at the University of Texas, El Paso, put it this way: Darwin's attempt to explain the origins of all the magnificent species in the living world in terms of the struggle for survival is easily the dumbest idea ever taken seriously by science. The third important evidence for evolution is mutations. Mutations are copying mistakes in our genes, in the DNA. In the early 20th century, scientists realized that natural selection had no creative power, so they turned to mutation as the source of evolutionary creativity. Now, there's a joke, which might offend some people, about three men who went fishing in a boat on a lake one day, when all of a sudden an angel appeared. When the men got over the shock, one said to the angel, "I've had a bad back since I was hit by shrapnel in the Vietnam War. Would you be able to help me?" "Sure," said the angel, and he touched the man's back. Straight away his back was healed, and the man felt relief for the first time in years. The second man in the boat wore thick glasses and had a hard time reading and driving. He asked the angel if he could do anything to help him. The angel smiled. He reached out and took the glasses and threw them into the lake. As soon as they hit the water, the man was able to see perfectly again. When the angel turned to the third man, he put out his hands defensively. "Don't touch me. I'm on disability benefits." Now, we all probably know people who suffer from a disability, and most of them deserve all the help and support that they can get. But there are some people on benefits who are not very disabled. To understand the third important evidence for evolution, we need to keep in mind the words disability benefits. Hold on to that little expression and we will see its relevance soon. Evolutionary scientists nowadays admit, when they're pressed, that natural selection is empty. It has no creative power. Instead, they claim that mutations, that is copying mistakes in our DNA, provide the raw material, the source of new biological features, which natural selection can select, and so generate all the kinds of wonderful new varieties of life on Earth. When genetic mutations were discovered in the early 20th century, there was a frenzy of mutation breeding using radiation and chemicals to fast forward evolution. But bombarding fruit flies with radiation or chemicals causing mutations only ever produced thousands of disabled, defective and dead flies. Mutations in human beings cause terrible birth defects and genetic diseases like cystic fibrosis, haemophilia or Down's syndrome. So mutations are disabilities. However, some mutations come with benefits. Some mutations are not lethal or deadly. Some mutations may even be beneficial. Here is an example that may help explain mutations. Some beetles have a mutation where they lose their wings. Although the mutation has caused a disability, the lack of wings can actually have a benefit if these beetles live on small, windy islands. Why? Well, because wingless beetles don't get blown out into the sea and drown. Beetles without wings enjoy disability benefits if they live on a small, windy island. In evolutionary terms, natural selection would cause wingless beetles to outbreed flying beetles and take over the island. However, and here's the crucial point, this mutation did not involve gains. It involved losses. Wings were lost, not added. Mutations have not added wings where none existed beforehand. Here's another common example of a mutation that evolutionary biologists promote as proof that mutations can be beneficial. Sickle cell anemia is a terrible disease. It results in about 100,000 deaths per year worldwide. Sickle cell anemia is a genetic condition, a mutation that results in an abnormality in hemoglobin, the molecule that carries oxygen around the bloodstream. Sickle cell anemia has one benefit, however. It protects carriers from malaria, an even deadlier disease, which causes over 500,000 deaths per year. Sickle cell anemia provides an advantage if a person lives in a malaria-prone region of the world. But it is only beneficial in the way that an amputation is welcomed by someone with gangrene. It is a disability with one benefit. The same applies to other cases of mutations promoted as evidence for evolution, like bacterial resistance to antibiotics or malarial resistance to anti-malaria drugs. These cases involve a mutation breaking something, although this disability nevertheless results in a side benefit. Evolutionary biologist Lynn Margulis explains it like this. Darwinists say that new species emerge when mutations occur and modify an organism. I was taught over and over again that the accumulation of random mutations led to evolutionary change, led to new species. I believed it until I looked for evidence. Margulis stated elsewhere, new mutations don't create new species, they create offspring that are impaired. Trying to evolve new creatures by mutations is like throwing an old-fashioned rotary dial phone at a wall multiple times in the hope it will turn into a modern smartphone. It won't. All you'll have is a smashed up old rotary phone. Mutations are real. They're scientifically observable processes, but they do not have the power to produce evolutionary changes of the sort that will turn frogs into princes. Mutations are going in the wrong direction. They cause damage. They cause decay and disorder and death. If evolution is going to turn bacteria into brain surgeons, mutations must create new raw materials like nerve cells, bones, blood, skin, muscles, etc. And evolution must also somehow engineer combinations of these new structures to produce new organs of incredible coordination like kidneys, livers, fingers, or ears. But the problem is that mutations do the very opposite. Evolutionary biologists claim that time is the saviour here. Given enough time, eventually enough beneficial mutations will produce new structures. But lots of mutations over millions of years will not build new structures because they are causing damage, not creating biological masterpieces. Dr. Lee Spetner put it this way, whoever thinks macroevolution can be made by mutations that lose information is like the merchant who lost a little money on every sale but thought he could make it up in volume. Pierre-Paul Grasset was professor of evolution at the Sorbonne for over 30 years and was president of the French Academy of Sciences. He wrote this, "The opportune appearance of mutations permitting animals and plants to meet their needs seems hard to believe. Yet the Darwinian theory is even more demanding. A single plant, a single animal would require thousands and thousands of lucky appropriate events. Thus miracles would become the rule. Events with an infinitesimal probability could not fail to occur. There is no law against daydreaming, but science must not indulge in it." So here is a third piece of evidence, and the third problem for evolution. Mutations do not build new and improved biological structures, they break them. Evolution is running in exactly the wrong direction. It is not evolution, it is devolution. Someone has said that evolution, when all boiled down, teaches that living beings created themselves. Now, if you think that sounds a little bit too like a fairy tale, you would be right. The agnostic scientist Michael Denton wrote that the Darwinian theory of evolution is no more or less than the great cosmogenic myth of the 20th century. I would go even further and say that evolution is the greatest scam in the history of science. It is the biggest con in the history of Western civilization. Evolution is bogus science. The fossil record does not show evidence of life gradually evolving. The missing links are still missing. Natural selection and mutations are not God substitutes. They have no creative powers. Mutations just damage things. And natural selection just gets rid of those damaged things. The evidence for evolution does not stand up to scrutiny. Has science disproved God? Not at all. Evolution is a crutch for atheists desperate to suppress the obvious truth that God is our creator. If you enjoyed this video, or if you want to investigate this subject of whether God really exists further, I encourage you to get a copy of my new book, Why There Really Is a God. The link is in the description below.